But I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us in what I hope is a interesting and important discussion. And if you have questions, please stick your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them a little bit later. We know that there's going to be a good discussion here, so frequently the questions are the best part. So don't hold back with questions and comments. I am going to read a bio real quick, just a short bio on Craig. Our guest is Craig Silverman. He's a Canadian journalist. He's the media editor at BuzzFeed, and he was the former head of BuzzFeed's Canadian division. He's also the author of numerous books, and he is an expert on fake news. We're real happy to have you with us, Craig.
Thank you.
And sorry, let me get the screen back. And my name is Mike Kamber, and I was a journalist for approximately 25 years. I worked at the New York Times for about 10 years, and I'm the founder and director of the Bronx Documentary Center. So with that, we'll get it rolling. So Craig, I guess, one of the things we were chatting a little bit earlier, and one of the things that struck me is a lot of the young people that we work with here at the BDC have only been really following politics, since, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And they sort of think that the place that we are in now is normal because it's what they've grown up with.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking recently to 1988 when Gary Hart was the front runner for the presidential, the Democratic, nominee. And he was caught in one lie. He basically, was caught in one situation where he had lied to the public, and he was judged unworthy, and he had to drop out of the race, and it was pretty much the end of his, presidential aspirations. Can you talk for a minute about how things have evolved and how sort of unnatural this time is that we're in, assuming you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, if we talk about specifically, the question of how normal is it, for example, to have the president of the United States, as well as, say, senators or members of Congress and others who are, openly embracing conspiracy theories, who are, spewing falsehoods that are not spin, that are not sort of like, well, I see the issue this way, and here are the facts that I'm going to choose to present and leave others out, right? Which has been around forever. And which has always been considered kind of fair game in politics. Right. It's like, well, I'm gonna spin this how I want. I'm gonna present it how I want. Right. And we can argue our various versions of spin. Sure. But it's not that. No. And you give the Gary Hart example. I mean, the reality is, like, on a really fundamental level, and this was said back in 2015 when Trump entered the race and instantly said and did things that would be disqualifying in any other scenario of the last, 100 years. Yeah. People saying, he's not fit, and Republicans said it. And this is where this is not a partisan thing that I'm saying. Republicans said it. I mean, Lindsey Graham, who is one of the president's biggest defenders now, said, if we nominate him, we will get killed and we will deserve it. He's a racist. He is. Yeah. I mean, these are literally things that Lindsey Graham said about Donald Trump. And so
Ted Cruz, there's a great Ted Cruz quote about Trump being a pathological liar, and he could pass any lie detector test because he just lies all day long.
Yeah. So, and so in those early stages, everybody was like, well, the system's going to kick in. He's going to get booted out, right? Like, we can't allow this to happen. But it is different. It was different in the things he was saying and doing, and in the way that instead of disqualifying him, it actually served to push him up and get him more and more attention. And so, a thing that happened is that Trump was really good at understanding and manipulating our current media environment, where you have a huge amount of information, a huge amount of voices competing. And when you literally had like 15 or 20 people on stage trying to get the Republican nomination and trying to get through and get their message across and attract, the voters, Republican voters at that first stage, somebody who is going to say completely crazy, outrageous things, but who is going to present them in a way where it seems like he's being real and everybody else is just being a politician. I mean, it was incredibly effective for Trump. And then, the conventional wisdom was, well, okay, that's going to win him the nomination because it's like diehard Republicans choosing a leader, but he's going to get killed in the general. And lo and behold, because his rallies were such a, crazy off the rails TV, everybody took it live. He got more and more attention, more and more momentum, and, managed to squeak through. And so, no, this is not the way leaders in American society and American politics typically behave. Usually they have been long disqualified if they behave this way. They remain fringe. But Trump managed to seize upon a moment in time of lots of dissatisfaction and, inequality, and managed to just, have things go in a way that ended up him being president. And then his behavior as president is completely out of the realm as well. And so, that just sort of puts us in a place where it's like, well, do things actually go back to sort of what was normal before Trump, or is it forever changed in the United States? And I think there's a lot of people who feel like it doesn't really just reset, especially when institutions have been undermined and when overall confidence in leadership and institutions have been undermined. So a long answer to say, no, this is, this is not the normal way things go. And the extent to which people have normalized it and become acclimated to it is actually one of the things that's a big concern right now.
Right. And again, circling back, do you feel that Trump is the problem or the symptom of the larger problem? It sounds like there's a larger problem that, in terms of where people have media literacy, and all the other things that we'll get into, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's, there's both of those things are going on. I mean, he's accountable for what he says and what he does, and how completely, off the rails it has been, and seems to be getting and always found a new level. Like just when you thought it couldn't get crazier, it couldn't get worse in terms of, even like I say, if you set aside whatever his, policy priorities are, just talking about the actual behavior and conduct in office. And since the election, just absolutely mainlining completely fringe, insane conspiracy theories, and then blasting them out from his extremely powerful Twitter account and Facebook page. And that's where we get to the other part where, okay, is he a symptom of some larger things? And I mean, if we talk about sort of the media environment, I think the fact of that the most extreme kind of wins out in a saturated environment. Like I think he represents that really well, but also what he represented really well is that, there were really dedicated people who belonged to very fringe, extreme online communities who glommed onto Trump back in 2015 when he first declared. Right. And so these communities, people on like 4chan, and then eventually it was like there was a Reddit community. These are very fringe, like, racist communities who said he was our guy. And they really made as much of an effort as possible to kind of create an online movement around him. And they would, make the support for him seem bigger than it was in those early stages. And I think that had an effect of bringing people to it where they felt like, he has real momentum and he has, lots of people behind him. They would do things like they'd manipulate online polls, and they would create lots of fake accounts on Twitter, and they would get out there into discussions and pretend to be supporters. Russia did a similar kind of thing, right? And so I think he reflects some of the symptoms of an environment that is rewarding extreme, but is also rewarding manipulation. And somebody who is able to combine extreme with understanding of the kind of visual communication nature and virality, dynamics of the current moment. There are things that really are possible of building a movement and bringing people to you.
Right. I mean, he does seem to have a certain type of genius for the media, which, as a journalist, we covered him, in the 1980s, in 1980s, 1990s in New York, and he was hilarious. I mean, we just thought he was the greatest joke ever. And kind of this hilarious, over the top, completely nonsensical New Yorker that, went about, fleecing contractors, fleecing business partners. And, he was, sort of harmless unless you were in the real estate community or, a small contractor going to work for him. So it's really quite extraordinary to to
Mm.
see this thing that's happened recently. Do you Alex Jones got behind him pretty early on. Do you include Alex Jones in what you're talking about, or is that a separate? I mean, Alex Jones was maybe a step up from 4chan and such.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Alex Jones was I think the Trump era elevated Alex Jones more into the mainstream than he'd ever been before. And so like Trump was sort of the extreme tide that lifted all boats sort of thing.
Right.
In that, Alex Jones he was seen as kind of a joke. He had obviously gotten huge blowback for the way he reacted to the mass killings at Sandy Hook, where he
Right.
was talking about it being a hoax, giving
Right.
giving airtime to the idea that these were crisis actors, and it never happened. And so
Yeah.
he was always this fringe buffoon, hawking supplements and other products, who
Right.
who'd only ever
Yeah.
get mainstream attention when he said and did really horrible or over the top things, talking about like gay frogs and
Yeah.
this kind of stuff.
But millions of followers, and algorithms pushing him.
Yeah,
Infowars.
well, it's true. Like this is one of the things about fringe players like him, is they saw the potential of the new, more democratized media universe before, of course, mainstream journalists and others who already had a big platform. People like
Right.
Alex Jones and others, and also, for a lot of American conservatives who felt like they haven't been represented well in mainstream American, left-leaning
Right.
institutions, they also saw the emergence of Facebook and YouTube and the early web and all
Mhm.
those things as great
Right.
opportunities to just like get
Right.
around the media.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, YouTube was rewarding Alex Jones with audience, with advertising revenue, and they, all of these platforms wrap themselves in the cloak of free speech because
Right.
they didn't, they thought it was kind of easy to do that, and in a very, obviously a very American, message to push, and a good
Yeah.
thing to be all about free speech, but they had clear policies that people like Alex Jones and others were arguably violating, and they just didn't enforce it. And so I
Right.
think that's another thread of this, is that these platforms really were so loose and free and didn't really care about the
Mhm.
consequences of what they were allowing, and of people who were actually violating their policies.
Right.
And it just got completely out of hand,
Mhm.
really from the period of about, for me, it was like 2014 to 2016 was when
Mhm.
a lot of these fringe players just started to build up really big audiences. And when a lot of
Mhm.
people saw that there was a huge business in pushing very hyper partisan content on Facebook, for example, where you could get insane amounts of traffic just writing really torqued partisan headlines on real news events, you'd get
Mhm.
oceans of traffic and you could make a lot of money on a website. And so you had all these players moving in, and Trump gave them tons of material, and
Right.
then Facebook and YouTube gave them tons of audience, and it was an
Right.
ecosystem that really exploded.
Right. And everybody was making money, uh, and the American people were losing out, basically.
Yeah, I mean, where was the discussion of policy and other things like that? It was
Mhm.
kind of this, the Trump circus of the next crazy thing that happened.
Right.
And that was great TV, because
Yeah.
that's what Trump has always known how to do. He knew how to self promote, and he was
Yeah.
often great TV, whether it was on The
Yeah.
Apprentice or long before that. He would say shocking or outrageous things, but not as shocking and as outrageous as they got when he entered the race. And so
Right.
it says a
Right.
lot about the media environment, and it's not just Trump. If you look to 2016 and the national elections in the Philippines, Duterte was, very aggressive with having paid trolls to harass his opponents. They
Mhm.
spread vicious falsehoods and rumors about their opponents. They used
Right.
tons of fake accounts, running pages, infiltrating Facebook groups,
Mhm.
and that was early in the year in 2016, and that was really a wake-up call for a lot of people who pay attention to this stuff, of like how bad it was getting, and it just kept getting worse through it. And Brexit had a lot of similar kind of manipulation on
Right.
Facebook, and then Trump
Right.
was happening again. And so, and we can go back even earlier than that. For me, in 2014, when Russian troops and separatists in Ukraine aligned with
Right.
Russia, shot
Yeah.
down a Malaysian Airlines jet,
Yeah.
And that kicked off to me probably one of the most, to that point, the most important online disinformation campaign to muddy the waters of who was responsible and try to blame Ukraine and deflect blame from Russia. And a lot of that playbook ended up really just like getting taken up and expanded on in the ensuing years.
Mm-hmm. How important has Russia been to this? Because some people have made the point that Russia has sort of pioneered some of this stuff, and then it's been picked up and amplified and taken over, more as sort of a monetary thing for financial gain here, but also for political advantage, and that we no longer need Russia to do this because we're doing it ourselves now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I think when it comes to using the digital environment for political propaganda purposes and manipulating the digital environment, I do think Russia, was far more advanced than anyone and was investing in this earlier than anyone to a significant degree. So you can give them credit or you can give them blame, however you want to look at that. I mean, they saw that. They had conventional military power, but this concept of asymmetrical warfare, was a big thing for them. But it goes back to the Cold War as well.
Sure.
Russia and information operations, as I think people will see in the exhibit. I mean, this is something that they were trying to control media narratives and inject narratives into the media and into the conversation in the United States, in Western Europe, when it was the Soviets. And to be fair, the United States has also, especially during the Cold War, was fighting the same kind of information wars. They were funding, secretly funding magazines and other efforts in Germany and that
Poland.
was seen as a core part of it. There was a fantastic podcast recently called Winds of Change. And it was hosted by Patrick Radden Keefe. And he looked into this rumor he had long heard that the CIA either wrote or helped fund the song Winds of Change, which was the massive global hit by the Scorpions, which was seen as a sort of Cold War anthem for freedom.
Right.
And he unpacks all these rumors of all this stuff that the CIA did fund. The CIA funded kind of musical things and tours and things like that to kind of get Western culture injected into the Soviet Union, seeing that it would help young people rise up. And so yeah, like there is a long history of doing this kind of stuff. But when we move into the digital environment and social media, Russia was ahead of everybody else in terms of the ideas of trying to influence this space and using really professionals to do this. And I think we've seen a lot of other countries try to mimic it now. Like China for a long time was very focused domestically on strong information control domestically, but now they're actually doing more to try and push it around the world, especially with, when there were the protests in Hong Kong, they were running fake accounts on Twitter and other places to try and manipulate the debate. And so this is part of our information ecosystem now. Yeah.
And I believe Taiwan also, I think they're also pushing
I mean, and Taiwan is a model of resiliency of how they push back against Chinese disinformation efforts. But absolutely, I mean, China is it spent so long trying to dominate its own information space and has done that pretty well. And just over the last couple of years, they've really realized that as part of their efforts, like the Belt and Road initiatives and others, where they're like funding projects around the world for to have good relationships with governments. They're also saying, well, we need to also train journalists in the Chinese model of media, and we need to dominate in the social media environment when people are talking about China and issues related to China.
Right, absolutely. There was a great New York Review of Books article a few weeks ago looking at the history of a lot of what you're talking about, with Eastern Europe and the CIA, going back to the 1950s to, sending weather balloons over, to drop leaflets and, very what we would consider primitive. That's the other thing is, when I was growing up, it seemed like there was always some guy in his basement with a mimeograph machine, kind of cranking out something and putting a stamp on it and, trying to mail things out. I mean, I remember that as a child. Some pretty fringe stuff, seeing, leaflets from the John Birch Society and stuff, but it was actually incredibly intensive, labor intensive, and actually pretty costly. I mean, you had to actually go out and give all these things out, or you had to pay for stamps and mail them out. It was it's a big operation. And now, of course, we're talking about just, a few clicks and enormous reach. Really.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of, it gets to the fundamental changes that we've seen, and I think it is important to underline just how much and how quickly things have changed. And so when we think about the fact that the information environment seems so polluted right now, and people really seem to be struggling to sift through and know what to trust, in a sense, it's kind of understandable because of how much things have changed just in the last 5 or 10 years, particularly with smartphones and the advent of this kind of consuming information in the stream of your Facebook news feed or on Twitter. And so, you know, what you're talking about is like, yeah, there were always people who were self-publishing, who were using and producing media, but it was hard to get a big audience, and it was labor intensive, and and distribution was really hard to get. Like,
really hard.
How do you find an audience and get them, right? I mean, it's like you worked at the New York Times. New York Times had its own printing presses. It had trucks. It had distribution systems, and it was integrated. And if you wanted to build a big audience, you needed to have satellite dishes and newspaper delivery trucks and printing presses and all these things. And so that is the great change that happened, was the just total democratization of distribution, where it moved to some of these really big platforms that invited everyone and said, you know, anyone's voice is welcome, and we can potentially get you a really big audience. And that is, I mean, that's obviously a great thing to have that level of democratization. There are so many voices and points of view that did not get exposed and that did not have the weight and force of kind of mainstream media behind them. And it's great for communities and people who are marginalized to be able to build their own media and communities easily. Everything comes, you know, with the downside. And the downside is that it is so easy to manipulate an environment that is that democratized. And the companies that own these dominant platforms like Google and Facebook and Twitter were really lax and just thought it was such an easy, simple thing of wrap ourselves in the idea of freedom of speech and not worry about manipulation, not worry about harassment, not worry about, you know, the downsides of not actually trying to moderate our platforms properly. And so they've been trying to kind of get back everything that they sort of allowed and lost for the first, you know, 3/4 of their existence. And really it's just been the last 4 years that all of them have sort of said, okay, let's get our arms around this problem and find a way to protect free speech, but also to enforce policies and create an environment that it is not going to punish people, you know, with harassment and other kinds of things.
Right. One of the fascinating things I saw recently, it's somewhere in our timeline. John, I don't know if you're there, but maybe you could show a little bit of our timeline so people will know where to go to if they want to take a look at it on our website. We're updating it all the time, but we have an exhibition that's called The End of Truth, and we spent many months sort of researching a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that I found was fascinating was that I think more than half of the people that joined extremist groups online, they didn't find those groups by accident. Those groups were actually recommended to them by algorithms, primarily on YouTube, also Facebook and other places. And
yeah, I mean, it's radicalization by recommendation engine is this is something that they didn't really think about or care about until relatively recently. And also kind of going back to 2014, that's when ISIS became in the sort of global consciousness. It was around the fall or so, summer or fall of 2014. And the US government went to these platforms in 2014 and said, you guys have a terrorism problem because ISIS is all over your platform and they are recruiting people. And all of the platforms took that seriously, and they worked really hard to try and chase ISIS off their platform, if not completely make it harder for them. But
what about the domestic terrorists? You know,
well, you know, there's that, and also, you know, what they tried to do was recognize ISIS content in automated ways and other things, but they didn't necessarily address the fundamental dynamics of their platforms, which was building them in a way so that it identifies content that is either getting strong interaction and could potentially get even more interaction if more people saw it, or trying to identify signals that you know suggest something should be amplified more. And this is fundamental to how they operate in their business model, which is that they want you to spend as much time on their platform as possible. They want you engaging with it, liking, sharing, commenting. Those are all signals that they take. And so for them, the recommendation engines were just built to see like, well, what's getting traction? And of course, if you talk about extremist content, the people who interact with it in very strong ways. Right. And so if you are detecting those early signals, you will start to push it out to more people saying, hey, this is, getting good traction. Yeah. And because they're good at identifying potential audiences, they start matching extremist content with audiences who are potentially interested in extremist content. And you can radicalize people that way. And that was, it was an early concern with YouTube. Facebook has, one of the things that Facebook did that we reported that they didn't really publicly make a big deal about, but around the election, they turned off some of the recommendation engines to try and stop, recommending groups of conspiracy groups or voter fraud groups or things like that. And so now they're aware of the potential danger of their own recommendation products and how those can throw people down a rabbit hole or actively push them to conspiracy content. And so, this is a big problem. Right. They're all saying that they've done a better job of addressing this. But they also, they'll never fully be able to say, we don't recommend extremist or violative content. They'll never be able to say there's no disinformation on our platform because the platforms are too big for any of them to actually know exactly what's going on at any moment.
Right. They also spent years and years recommending these things through their algorithms. I mean, Tristan Harris, has done some podcasts and he's in the new movie that the name is escaping me. And, they spent years and years with these algorithms pushing out really the most extremist stuff out there, neo-Nazi stuff, crazy InfoWars stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And it's really just very recently that they're saying, okay, now we see there's a problem. Well, this has been going on for, 7-8 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, these are longstanding issues, and people like Alex Jones and others really, they built big audiences by getting recommended, and they understood. This goes back to really where we started with Trump. What happened on YouTube is that, a lot of the more extreme content was what started getting recommended and started getting traction, but get kicked up by YouTube itself because it stood out in an ocean of, really bland, middle of the road video.
Right. But the stuff about policy decisions that nobody's really that interested in. It's too complicated.
Or people uploading family videos and just completely non-political content. And so people who came in with more extreme and in your face and shocking kinds of political takes, well, that really cuts through compared to C-SPAN, right?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Without a doubt. It's, it's been well documented that, things that are outrageous, things that make you angry, things that make you scared are the things that tend to get shared. I mean, there's numerous studies showing this. Things that are not so controversial, they generally don't get the clicks and the likes and the shares. And, every click and every share is money for the platform. So,
yeah, I mean, that's where for the average person, this is where everybody should kind of realize that this is where you have some power and some responsibility. The way these systems are built is they look for those signals of that are happening around content to determine, whether it's popular, whether it should be shown to more people, that kind of thing. And so you individually, I mean, there's more than 2 billion people on Facebook's products, but you individually, you have a little bit of power. If you are liking and sharing things, you are sending signals to kind of the big machine. And if people are a little more strategic about the way that they give their attention and how they interact with things, and if they realize that, then you should spend your attention in ways that kind of elevate the things you think should be elevated. And people should be aware that the things you do and the behavior you take on these platforms really does have an effect. And if everybody was a little more strategic, a little more conscious of this, if they had this sense of emotional skepticism of, like you said, of if you read something and it makes you really angry, the best thing you can do is to not, share it or like it or comment. The best thing you could do is actually take a breath and ask and look at it again and say, why has this made me so angry? And what website is this from? Or who is this person? Just literally 5 or 10 seconds. And if we all trained ourselves to do that, then we would short circuit some of these things.
Yeah. I love to tell the story about one of my family members. Actually, this is a woman with a college degree, and was going on these long tangents about how much Obama hated the environment. I was like, that doesn't make sense. He's and a friend of the environment to what I've seen. And so I said, can you send me some of this stuff? And she sent me this conglomeration of stuff that she had picked up, and some of it was from like almost neo-Nazi websites, the Proud Boys, and then some of it was from the extreme left, from like these Communist Party, young communists of America sites. Really fascinating, like complete opposites, but she just picked up these little fragments and put it all together. And that was where she was getting her worldview. Do you?
Yeah. It's an empowering thing to be able to do that, right? Like before, you could go to a newsstand, you could buy lots of different newspapers and magazines, but it's like there's effort, there's money involved in that. With this, you can feel like you're doing research because you went to, you found a whole bunch of stuff on Facebook or a whole bunch of other places, and you put it all together, and you feel like you've done a good amount of research and pulled these things together. And that's where, we need to help really equip people to be able to distinguish between different quality of information. It's not about training them that here's a bunch of good news organizations and everything else is bad. It's really about giving people some useful skills that they can look at information and analyze, like, what is the claim here? What is the evidence supporting it? Where is this coming from? And make some good judgments. And that's, that's really where the whole QAnon conspiracy theory, where if you look at it on its face, it's insane. The idea that there is, an elite cabal of pedophiles controlling the world, and that Donald Trump has been elected to kind of take them all down. Right. There are other elements of it, but those are kind of some of the core pieces of it.
Right. But there's a little bit of cannibalism, a little bit of blood sucking.
This is it. Yeah. It gets into some occult kind of stuff and child trafficking and these kinds of things. But if you look at the way people who are into QAnon talk about it, they call themselves, researchers and digital soldiers. And the language of research and journalism and of gathering information is really the way they talk. And so all you have to do is like, if there's stuff out there to be found that confirms what you want, like, then you feel like you've gone out and connected the dots. And so, people can kind of choose their own reality in that sense. And even more than that, alternative reality communities like QAnon, they become very present on digital platforms, and they leave the breadcrumbs there for people to find, and they're able to recruit and bring people in that way. So, and then when you have the president elevating QAnon accounts on Twitter and other things like that, it gives a seal of approval to it. That symbol of authority and that position of authority makes people feel like they're really onto something.
Right. It's fascinating that it's really this tremendously empowering thing in a certain way. Yeah, that's I had not really thought of it that way until recently. We had a question in our chat. Somebody asked, why is it they've been pushing deep state conspiracies? What is the agenda behind this push on the deep state? Where does that come from? And
I think so. A couple of broad pieces on that. So one is if you look at the cornerstone of conspiracy theories in general, is that what they really do is they bring a sense of order to a chaotic world that we all live in.
A complex world.
It's a complex world where horrible things happen without good explanation for them. Bad things happen to good people. All this, heavy reality that we have to deal with and struggle through. The beauty of conspiracy theories is that they help explain it all for you. They put it in a very, simple kind of thing, which obviously gets layers and more complicated the more you get into it, but there is an explanation. And so the idea of a deep state that, horrible, venal, controlling people, a small group of them who've actually been responsible for a lot of the horrible things going on, that is a more satisfying answer than complexity. And so deep state to me on that global kind of level is just the new manifestation of the sort of simple one explanation to get rid of some of the anxiety and difficulty of understanding and making sense of our world. Now, specifically, I mean, very early on with Trump, this is where the term deep state really took on more life, where the idea was that, Trump was coming in as an insurrectionist to the US government and what was going to happen to institutions. And there were early articles talking about, bureaucrats and, people with longer term appointments who saw themselves as sort of the professional managers of government who were going to push back against whatever things Trump was going to try to do to undermine democracy.
Right.
And so the idea then got spun as there is a deep state trying to undermine Trump's presidency. And eventually that became fused with the conspiracy theory of Pizzagate, which is that high-ranking Democrats were actually pedophiles. And this sort of got into the QAnon thing, which is that Trump was going to come in and actually get rid of this horrible, corrupt, pedophile deep state that had been secretly controlling and ruling the world, and Trump was going to eradicate it all. And so it was a conspiracy of opportunity to a certain extent, but also fits with, one, Pizzagate that had already been kind of bubbling up, and with the general theme of conspiracy theory, which is helping you believe that, there is a dark evil force, but in this case, that there was also someone who was coming in to smash it, and that you knew that and other people didn't.
Right. It's tremendously empowering to be in on the secret that nobody else knows.
Yeah.
I think people, I've talked to a number of people, and they really seem to draw a real strength from that. It's a confusing, chaotic world in which a lot of people feel they don't have power. They vote for somebody and there's no change. And there are all these, the economy goes this way or the economy goes that way. And I think they feel they're a pawn in the whole thing. And suddenly they have the keys to this and they understand it for the first time. And that's tremendously empowering.
It is. I mean, that's an amazing message. And it becomes such an empowering message that, the fact that sort of Q, the supposed, person in the US government with high clearance who was leaking all the material, the details of this, the fact that Q has gotten so many things wrong, like almost everything wrong that they have predicted, doesn't matter. Because once you're in, and it's to an extreme extent now where they all believe that Trump was going to be reelected, and so as Biden as results are certified in the tight states, you can see these QAnon accounts doubling down and saying this is all just a trap. This is a trap where we will, by inauguration day, we will expose all of these fake votes, all of the, the voting machines that change votes. And so they whatever new information that comes that seems to undercut what they believed in, it doesn't matter because they can assimilate it into whatever view they have. And you can be 100%.
The more you argue, the more it seems to reinforce.
And when Biden becomes president, they will have an explanation for that too, that enables them to not have to let it go.
Right. I also, one of the things I always wonder about is, again, I'm a bit older, and when I grew up, we had 3 channels on TV, and we sat down every night and watched Walter Cronkite, and we didn't really get any more information until the next evening. We got the Portland Press Herald, and there would be one black and white photo, in the newspaper, but we were very limited in the information that we got, and I don't know that it hurt us in any way, So, but we're not going to turn the clock back. I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah. And there wasn't ever any golden age of media either. It's like, that seems like such a more orderly universe, but of course the tremendous downsides are that, most of the people producing that newscast in the paper were white men who had a particular socioeconomic background and who presented the world in a certain way. And so for a lot of people, that was a very comforting establishment kind of view of the world, that a lens where it just seemed like that's the way it was. And they didn't think of all those factors. But for a lot of other people, they looked at, those big media outlets and said, you are not representing me at all. And so, the great thing about this environment is all these voices and much more empowering. But it is an overheated, difficult to navigate environment where, often the worst and most extreme voices are being elevated, and where, we're not that far removed from that more orderly universe where we didn't have information hitting us at all times of day. And I think genuinely on almost like an evolutionary level, it's going to take time for us to actually adapt to this universe. And the one last caveat I'll add to that is, you and I, as people in media, like, we consume a lot of news and a lot of information, and I always have to remind myself, like, most people are not consuming as much news as me. They are not getting as much. And in fact, the overwhelming amount of information in the environment has created what people are calling news avoiders, which are people who are just like, I don't want to participate in any of this. It is way too much.
It's too much. Yeah, absolutely overwhelming. That leads into a great question here. Can you talk about what you see as the future of Parler or Parlay? I think it's pronounced Parler, Gab, and others, which are drawing viewers from the major platforms. Will these alternative unregulated platforms ultimately make it more difficult for extremists to recruit those who aren't already believers? Can you talk about that?
Good question. So, quick background. Parler and Gab are, Parler, both of those are roughly kind of Twitter clones to a certain extent. Parler, and both of them present themselves as being free speech platforms, and they are very much trying to appeal to mostly right-leaning Americans. Gab is the more extreme of the two of them. It has long been home to kind of more extreme, far-right, racist kinds of folks. But both of them are basically saying, hey, Twitter and Facebook are biased against conservatives. They are biased against free speech. Come to our platforms. We will do as little moderation as we possibly can, and you won't have to deal with their BS. And so
it's a free fire zone. Yeah.
This is it. And Gab is extreme. Like, Gab is positions itself as even more of the free speech platform than Parler. Like, the guy who founded Parler had a post, I think it was back in the summer, where he was like, listen, we do have some rules here. You can't threaten to kill people. You can't, like, he listed off some really basic kind of things. Just to make it clear, like, we're going to have a light touch, but guys, like, come on, don't go threatening murder people.
He sounds like a closet liberal.
Yeah, that's it. And this is, and so their pitch, it has become more and more appealing to a lot of conservatives who've been on the other platforms. And what we're seeing right now is, people like Sean Hannity and a lot of other folks who are influential conservative Americans saying, you can't trust these big platforms. Get on Parler. Come and see me there. And there's actually a Canadian-based video platform called Rumble, which has become very popular all of a sudden with folks on the right. I interviewed the CEO in Toronto a few weeks back, and their business is exploding right now. But they didn't necessarily position themselves as like being after right-wing Americans. His whole mission has been to dethrone YouTube, and so he'll do it any way he can. So so that's the background. Getting to the question, like. So they are getting some momentum. They're getting some momentum, because Trump and others are pushing it. Whether they can sustain it, whether they can grow, as the question, sort of hints to, whether they can actually get more people than just like, folks who are very engaged online, right-leaning or far-right, in some cases, Americans, remains to be seen. They don't have big international usage on them. And the very fact that they are primarily seen and recruiting from the ranks of a particular political point of view, mostly around one country, kind of limits, like, if you're a more left-leaning person or just somebody who's not that interested in politics, like these platforms have very little for you.
The unsuspecting are not going to be just wandering around out there.
No, it's like you don't get to follow your favorite musical artist on Parler and Gab. You don't get to like join the conversation about The Bachelorette's latest episode on Parler and Gab. So they have sort of defined themselves within a niche that limits their growth. But the question was a really good one, is like, will it make it more difficult for extremists to recruit those who aren't already believers? So I think one risk is, you have this phenomenon called group polarization, which is the more you're surrounded by people who agree with you, the more extreme your views all become. And it's an unconscious thing that happens. So the group polarization that's happening on these platforms is like off the charts. And so I think they can be a breeding ground for radicalizing and making people become more extreme. But I also think what we'll see is they become perhaps the planning grounds where people realize if they want to convince people and bring them to their point of view, they got to go see the normies on Twitter and Facebook. So that's the place where they're going to percolate and probably become more extreme. And then they're probably going to go from those places to still try and get and influence people on the bigger ones. And so I think that, Yeah. And so the recruiting, I think, still has to happen where all the normies are, but the planning and coordination and radicalization happens on those platforms.
Right. And it's a complete free fire zone. They can say whatever they want, do whatever they want on Gab. There's no restrictions. And 4chan was that way.
Yeah. I mean, look, if people say and do things that break the law, that's, then their stuff will get removed. And so, what they're basically saying is, yeah, we're not going to have policies where we label your content, like Twitter does or whatever. They're saying, as long as you're not breaking the law or, then we're going to leave you alone. And that is their appeal, but it's an appeal that goes to a small segment of the population, certainly not a mainstream appeal.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let me ask you, I want to get to a couple more questions. Do you see similar tendencies on the left? Do you see an engagement in conspiracy theories and sort of a left ecosystem that has parallels to what's happening on the right?
I mean, there always is, like, and the reason is that, no one political point of view has a monopoly on conspiracy theories or disinformation. It's any of us at any given time could have messages that appeal to us that are false or misleading or extreme. It's about the situation. It's about, that moment in time and the dynamics of power and information and other things. So like, that's the context of it. It's like, yes, absolutely. You will see some stuff on the left. Right. But if we're being honest, the right-wing ecosystem for it is absolutely bigger. And I think it's bigger for a few reasons, but one of them that I would point to is that, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, is, decades ago, American conservatives said, one, they're very critical of the media and of media institutions at that time, said it's mostly a bunch of liberals from Ivy League schools and you're not representing our points of view. And there was
back to William F. Buckley. I mean, yeah, and certainly
absolutely.
Murdoch.
Yeah. And you know what? Like there have been and continue to be legitimate beefs about that. Just like African Americans and many other groups have legitimate beefs about not seeing proper representation in media. Exactly. But what the conservatives did was they said, we're going to continue to critique you and pressure you and demand that you represent us, but we're also going to build our own universe. And so talk radio and cable TV and those traditional platforms, for conservatives, they built very powerful conservative institutions and very profitable businesses as well. And then in the digital age, they just continued to move into those platforms as well. And so when you have a bigger ideologically driven information sphere, that group polarization happens and you're going to have more extreme in it. So the fact that there is a bigger conservative ecosystem, which is very opinion driven and not reporting driven, creates a fertile ground for it. Go ahead.
This is an extraordinary thing that, people forget that, the traditional media, for all of its faults, had bureaus all over the world. They had thousands of people working all over the world. It was tremendously expensive. Even small newspapers. I think, I was reading the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. They had bureaus in Africa and bureaus in Asia. I mean, Fox in particular, Murdoch and Roger Ailes. I mean, two geniuses, really, really smart guys. And obviously I abhor their politics and what they've done, but Murdoch, he got his first newspaper in 1952, and he slowly began to completely use the media to influence elections and actually bring down governments. And I think he got the New York Post in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. And then he slowly built this American, media empire. But part of it was that they're not going to have all this reporting. The reporting is too expensive. They're not going to have bureaus all over Africa and Asia and the Middle East. That costs a lot of money. So you can pay somebody a few $1 million a year to be a pundit. They've got, they had O'Reilly and they've got Hannity and a few other people. And it's enormously, I mean, they're raking in billions of dollars, hugely profitable, but their overhead is negligible.
Yeah. And a lot of times, I mean, if you look at an Alex Jones show, what he literally does most of the time is he prints off articles from news websites and he's sitting there circling the headlines and then talks about them. And that's what he does. Like, that's it. It's, and
there's no infrastructure.
And Rush Limbaugh does the same thing and has been doing the same thing for decades. So it is about, taking the news that somebody has spent the expensive resources to gather, and then critiquing that or using it as a basis for an opinion. And that's not to say that the news media is, our reporting is perfect and doesn't deserve criticism. I mean, like I wrote an entire book about the mistakes that journalists make and the issues with that and the dangers of that. And so, for me, critique of media and journalism is essential part of keeping us accountable.
Absolutely.
But I mean, if you're going to, really just take it and then only just lay your opinion on it, which often completely goes, away from what the facts are, there's accountability for that as well. And that's the critique I would make of sort of the conservative media universe is like, I just wish there was a lot more reporting going on and less of the opinions that completely oftentimes are left away from from what the actual facts are. And yeah,
I mean, when's the last time you saw Breitbart or Fox or Alex Jones break a major investigation? I mean, they just don't do it. It's not what they're about. And I do want to say, I started out working as a freelancer, and the first place I worked was the Village Voice, which was sort of considered this left wing, but I spent hours with fact checkers. I mean, they went through my stories line by line. I had to literally, give notes. I had to give phone numbers. They fact checked everything, and I've worked all over. If you spell a name wrong, there's hell to pay. If you get your facts wrong in a story, there's hell to pay. I mean, had editors, you lose your job for this. That's a very different media landscape than Fox and where we're at today. Rush Limbaugh, a lot of people don't know he's been around since the 1980s. I mean, almost as soon as they revoked the fairness doctrine, which I think was in the mid 80s, Rush Limbaugh had, tens of millions of listeners. I mean, he just took off. So
that's it.
No reporting going on.
Once you didn't need to once you didn't have a legal obligation to kind of represent both sides, yes, there was this blossoming of opinion-driven media in the United States, and really, really much more on the side of the right. But look, Trump's election did cause a lot of kind of liberal disinformation to get a market. And there's people who are kind of the hardcore kind of resistance folks would spread just ridiculous rumors about things that the Trump administration was not, was in fact not doing. And so it created a bit of a fever swamp on the left, in part because like Trump was doing outrageous things and coming up with really, policies that were just, very separate from stuff that Republicans would have done in the past.
Yeah.
And so there was
jailing children. I mean, but why do you need to amplify? Why do you need to go more extreme than that? I mean, why do you need to pretend that he's doing something more extreme than he's already doing?
Well, I think it's that people started to believe he was capable of anything. And also you had a lot of kind of left-leaning folks on Twitter who felt like it was their job to amplify anything horrible about Trump. And one of the things that you would see, like there'd be times where I'd be debunking some of these things. What people would say to you, well, okay, so maybe Trump didn't do this, but it's the kind of thing he would do. So like, and because I work at BuzzFeed News, which is, is seen as probably more on the left than on the right. I would have people on Twitter saying to me, come on, man, we're all here for the same cause. And like, I would have to explain, like, listen, no, actually my job is not to be supporting a cause. Like we have done extremely harsh reporting about Democratic politicians leading to some of them resigning. Like, whatever the personal politics of the people in the newsroom are.
You follow the story.
That's it. And I mean, and I also won't deny, like, yes, the newsroom, if you looked at the personal politics in the newsroom, it's definitely more left leaning, like, and you need to acknowledge that. Otherwise you look like you're hiding things. But if we have a story and it's a legitimate story and it's going to make somebody on the left or a Democrat look bad, like we're going to do that story. And that's that's the ethos there.
That's the foundation of democracy. That's the foundation of democracy. Without that, we've got nothing.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and in terms of like the liberal disinfo stuff, I mean, I think a lot of some of the overheated coverage about what Russia did or ended up not doing and Trump's connections to Russia, I think that was another place where you saw people on the left and some publications kind of getting over their skis a bit and talking about it like 100% Trump is owned and operated by Vladimir Putin. Like you would see stuff like that, and those are the kinds of things that I saw appealing to people more on the left. And in fairness, like you had John Brennan, former, I guess, head of the, what was it, the CIA?
He ran the CIA.
Who was on MSNBC saying things very early on in the Russia investigation that made it seem like there was insane stuff about Trump and Russia that was about to come out. And I think his conduct was really irresponsible in the stuff he was saying, particularly on MSNBC at the time.
Right. Well, it's the mark of a good journalist for you to say that. I mean, I think Pete Hamill used to say, journalists are not cheerleaders, and we're not. We're supposed to be following the story, and it's not supposed to be a left-right thing. I mean, of course, there is bias. I don't think there were too many Republicans working at most of the newspapers I came up at, but still, we've got to follow some of this. Let's take a couple more questions. It's getting late. I don't want to keep you too much longer. It's after 7. What do you think journalists could have done differently from day one in the Trump administration to limit White House disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some soul searching, particularly from the 2016 campaign. Like, I think one obvious mistake was all of the networks taking Trump's rally after rally after rally, where he wasn't making news, he was just saying outrageous things, taking that live and giving it massive audience. Like he hadn't earned the right to that audience. He was basically saying the same things over and over again. They only took it to see what outrageous lie he would tell. And then you're just giving that so much oxygen. But
it was nothing different than what he had done the day before.
It was the same shtick. But, the question was specifically about the administration. What could have been done to limit White House disinformation? So, I mean, one unsatisfying part of my answer will be, I don't think there's a lot that would have deterred Trump himself from his behavior. Like he is who he is, and he's been that guy for a very long time. And he won the election being who he was. But I think it comes down to this really thorny and difficult question of like, what is the difference between just sort of amplifying them versus doing your job of covering and the legitimate news that is, that comes out of a White House. So I think it's finding that calibration on that. If the media from day one had sort of said, well, we're not just going to like, by default, broadcast a lot of stuff live instantly because, very clearly we see they're going to be lying, they're going to be manipulating. So I think taking less things live would have been good. And sort of saying to people in the administration, it's like, if you have a big announcement, that's great. But if you continue to lie in big announcements, we can't take them live because we have a duty to not spread falsehoods. And that would have been a huge fight if they had said that. And the White House would have used that as a way to say, see, the liberal media won't cover us.
The liberal media. Yeah. I mean, he is, like it or not, he is, theoretically the most powerful person in the world. This is the guy with the nuclear codes and all the rest of it. So,
he's newsworthy.
It's newsworthy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So but it's, how do you say we're not going to cover this because we've decided that we don't approve of what he's saying?
Yeah, I think what the idea there is it's more sort of like, we need to have a bit of time. We can't take you live right away, or we can't disseminate instantly because we need to have a couple of seconds here to actually see what's going on with it. And granted, there'll be, there's no way to enforce that across the board. Like a bunch of outlets will just run with it right away. But I think if from day one, some of the larger outlets said, we're going to do a
time delay or what? We're going to fact check and do a time delay.
We're going to do a time delay. We're not just going to blast out everything that comes from the White House right away. We're going to apply a layer to it and make it clear what that layer is and what that type of delay is. If some people had that sort of little bit of a circuit breaker in there, then what you would have seen is you'd see a bunch of the stuff come out right away with just, crazy, ludicrous things. But then you would have seen a second wave of the places that spent a little bit more time and thought about it, who would frame it and give it context. So it's not like you're silencing the president and the administration, but it's like, here is what they're giving us, but we're going to wrap it in the context of his history and accuracy and give it to people in a way where they can make sense of it rather than hitting them with the lie right away.
Right. I've noticed, particularly the Times, I think the Washington Post has been pretty aggressive for a while, but I've noticed the Times is the last few months has gotten super aggressive in saying, false statement by the president, or the president, in their news stories, not in the opinion stories, the president is repeating these lies, etc. I think they've really ramped it up in terms of that, which I didn't see in 2016 when he was first elected.
There was a whole debate about, do you call it a lie? I mean, this was like, I know some people who aren't in journalism will probably think it's unbelievable that this was a thing, but in journalism circles in 2016, as Trump was taking over as president, there was a whole debate about, do you call the president a liar? And, Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, was very, straight about saying, I think we have to be very judicious about when we use the L word, and meanwhile,
despite the fact that Trump was telling bald-faced lies that were demonstrably false.
Yeah. And I mean, you had said earlier, like, this guy is a New York character. I mean, he was lying about big events going back a very long time, He
was lying about how many stories his buildings, you could count the stories. Yeah. He would say it was 70 stories. You could stand on the street and see that it was 60 stories. I mean, it was hilarious.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's where I think some people outside the media were just kind of like, can you guys get your shit together, please? Right. I mean, you're going to argue about this while he's going to blanket the country in lies. And it's not even about defending newsrooms. It's just more like, it was to go back to where we exactly started. It was so unprecedented that newsrooms had never had to think about this and how to deal with this and how to frame it. And for me, I've been reporting on kind of disinformation, this kind of stuff for about a decade. And in 2016, there was me and there were a couple great reporters, Brandy Zadrozny and Ben Collins at the Daily Beast. And as far as I could tell, we were the only people really full time on like the garbage beat of the disinformation and the manipulation. And now there are disinformation reporters at major news organizations all around the world. Whereas, so the capacity and the knowledge is being built, but it wasn't there in the early days. And it was something that newsrooms really struggled with.
Right. Completely unprecedented. Yeah. And, there was also the issue that if you ran around calling the president a liar in your news stories, then you were also kind of feeding into the right-wing stuff that said that you are partisan and that you were not reporting the news, that you were making value judgments about, the politicians that you're supposed to be covering. So it gets into some really, really tricky stuff.
You're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So then it's at the end of the day, it's like, well, what are your principles and what's your job? What are you supposed to be doing? But you're right. Like some of it felt like it was almost a trap of like daring you to do certain things.
Right. One thing, we've got a great question there about Steve Bannon. And, one of the things that's fascinating about Steve Bannon is that I think he was vice president of Cambridge Analytica, and Cambridge Analytica stole data from, I forget, 60 million Facebook users or something. And then he went to Breitbart, where he, supported Trump and kind of specialized in information and far right things, sort of neo-Nazi, a lot of racist stuff, etc. And then he became, Trump's campaign manager, basically, and went to the White House. I mean, just extraordinary. His name, as we did all this research, his name would keep coming up, but in completely different organizations. I mean, he really got around.
He's got a real hustle going on. Today,
and then now he was just indicted for taking money for a Build the Wall movement and then keeping the money, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there was a whole, because Trump said he'd get Mexico to pay for the wall. That didn't happen. And so there were people who fundraised to build a wall along the border. And Bannon was one of the people sort of, put forward in this, it was either a PAC or like a nonprofit. And yes, the government alleges that he and others enriched themselves with the funds that were supposed to go to building a wall. And so he's now facing charges. But also, I mean, it is a remarkable kind of trip for him because, Bannon, he left the White House on the outs with Trump and, couldn't really go back to Breitbart. No one was really sure what he was going to do. And he ended up finding his new meal ticket because it used to be the Mercers who funded Cambridge Analytica, funded Breitbart, and today are the major investors in Parler.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so billionaire family with very big funders of right-wing causes and initiatives, and so Bannon was on the outs with them as well.
Yeah,
and so
it's Rebecca and her father.
It's Rebecca and her father. Yeah, she's really the driving force. He sort of stepped away, but he was the one who built the fortune.
Wow.
And today, Bannon found his new meal ticket in a exiled Chinese billionaire who is running his own kind of media operation.
Yeah.
Very anti-Chinese Communist Party guy. So him and Bannon are aligned on that. But,
Right.
they've been doing some really horrible things. Like there are actual Chinese dissidents in the United States who they put out and said that these are actually not Chinese dissidents. They're enemies of those of us who oppose the Chinese Communist Party. These people have protesters show up at their house. And so when
Right.
Bannon was arrested on these fraud charges, he was literally on the billionaire's boat.
Wow. Wow. Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. You can't make it up. I mean,
No.
he's kind of this Zelig-like figure. He just keeps popping up, in different places on the extreme right. And he's not a stupid guy. I think on the left we underestimate some of these folks and think that they're a bunch of idiots, but a lot of them are extremely intelligent and formidable.
He's all about controlling the messaging and dominating the information space. And, when in the early stages of the Trump administration, somebody had asked him, it was either, before Trump was elected or after Trump was elected, somebody had asked him sort of about their strategy. And a couple of things that he said. One, he said that the media is the opposition. That's the way he was running the campaign, that the media was the opposition, and Trump would call out the media every single speech. But the second thing that Bannon talked about was flooding the zone with shit. And so the idea was that, there would be so much garbage and false and misleading and conspiratorial stuff, and you would amp it up on all the platforms you could, and you get Alex Jones to push it out and Breitbart to push it out, that people wouldn't be able to distinguish the shit between the real stuff.
It's just a tidal wave of shit washing over people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a strategy. I guess the question was how was Trump elected despite this evidence that Bannon had been involved in stealing voter data, and I suppose it just didn't matter.
And we didn't learn until well after the election exactly what had kind of gone on with Cambridge Analytica. It's similar to the sort of the Russian interference. You didn't really understand it until the election was over and done with. And so all the Cambridge Analytica stuff didn't really break until like 2017. And so even to this day, there's still a lot of debate about, the impact and what Cambridge Analytica did with the Trump campaign and how much effect they had in the American election. There's no question that, yes, they had some profiles on Americans, and that was, apparently used in some of the ad targeting by the Trump campaign. But, a lot of the people who worked on the Trump campaign said that Cambridge Analytica were kind of snake oil salesmen and always oversold their stuff. But, there's no question, though, that they did completely against, the contract and the law, acquire a huge amount of Facebook data of people that they were not supposed to have.
Sure, through a British researcher, I think. Yeah.
That's right, a researcher who had gotten the data under an agreement with Facebook to conduct research, who then was not supposed to share it or sell it to a third party, and went and did that with Cambridge Analytica.
Right. Gotcha. Hey, John, I'm hoping that we can show, can we scroll through a little bit of the timeline? And also I'd like to show our resource pages, because I'm hoping that people will send this around really as an educational tool. Our website, which is The End of Truth, it's part of our Trump Revolution series at bronxdoc.org. And we have done other websites that have been used by hundreds of schools around the country and universities around the world. And we're hoping that people will go to this website. We'll continue to upgrade the website and add to it routinely. And if you click on that timeline there under view page, you'll be able to see a horizontal timeline there that you can scroll through. You can look at different decades, different eras. And if you click on any of the these balloons, you'll be able to see our sources. So we list all of our sources on our research. You can go through anything. There are links to the articles. There's links to radio pieces. There's links to videos that people have done. Everything is fact checked very carefully. And we're hoping that, teachers or individuals or researchers will be able to use this. And if folks out there, if you have stuff that you believe should be in the timeline that we've missed, you can send it to us, and we'll fact check it and get it in there as well. We've also got a resource page on here, which I think is important for some people. And if you look at the resource page, there's all kinds of different things about healthy tech use. Another thing, I don't know if you want to touch on this, Craig, but there's a huge problem. We work with teenagers here at the Bronx Documentary Center in our after-school programs. There's a huge problem with depression linked to overuse of social media. Even suicide, is rapidly increasing amongst young people. Is that something you could talk about at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I have two kids, and the whole question of how much screen time is too much and what media is appropriate for them is, I think, one of the big struggles for parents. And then as young people get older and, they have their own phone and they have access to screens anytime, if you look, I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about recommendation engines and the radicalization process. It is possible for any of us, if the right circumstances in our life, we're down about something, we're struggling with something, to go online and search for some kind of, sense of belonging or community, right, or information that really pulls us in. And, that is where that concern is, where there's so much to be found, and there can be support and love and great information to be found, but you can also go there and you can be pulled into some stuff that's really, really dark. And one of the things that I would just say, for people is that, there's a way to connect with real people through the online world, but your kind of real life connections, the people who you can spend time with and talk to and share, and share right, things with, are really, really important. And so, I think we've got to be, careful of folks who go so far into the world of screens and getting everything that way, and losing those real human connections. We are right, very social beings, and the internet can feel like it's meeting those social needs, but it's not the same as the stuff with people we know and who really know us. And so I think that balance of that real world and online is really important. And something for people to keep in mind, whether it's parents or just yourself. And one thing I'd recommend, you've got resources there. There was a podcast done by Kevin Roos of the New York Times called Rabbit Hole. And it's all about YouTube, and it has the first few episodes take a guy who was, I think he was in like his early 20s, and he was working a terrible job, and he was just not happy with his life. And he really right, he was just surfing. He was and YouTube became his thing, and he got into very hardcore political YouTube videos and became, adopted really misogynist points of view. And it really kind of, it was the thing that meant a need for him at that moment. And so that's the thing for the self-awareness, is like, what need is this meeting for you, and what are you getting from it? And operate with that level of self-awareness is really important, because you can kind of get lost in things. Right. Absolutely. Well, listen, we've had you for over an hour, and I guess we'll leave it there for tonight. Please check out our show. It's you go to bronxdoc.org, click on exhibitions. It's called The End of Truth. It's a website. It will be up indefinitely. We're not taking it down. We will be adding to it. And of course, check out Craig and what he's doing over at BuzzFeed. I think one of the few people who has had a really, really long-term sort of commitment to investigating disinformation and helping us understand the truth in the media landscape. So Craig, thank you so much. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. And look, I scrolled through the exhibit. I think there's tons of great info and material there for people. It's a great resource. It's a great piece of work. So congrats to you, and thanks for the work that you do. Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you to all the viewers also who stayed with us tonight. I know we started a little bit late, but keep in touch with us, send us an email, and we want to keep you as part of the BDC community. Thank you very much. Have a good night now.